Over the past few decades, nerdy media has transitioned from a fringe subculture to a mainstream phenomenon. What was once the sole domain of the weird and socially awkward has now become widely accepted and celebrated. This cultural shift has had significant implications for those who once found solace in niche communities. Simultaneously, there has been a notable rise in extremist political movements, such as the alt-right. In this video, we will explore the potential connections between these trends and consider why marginalized individuals who once sought refuge in nerd culture have found a much more dangerous community within the alt-right. Nerd culture, characterized by a deep personal connection with science fiction films, fantasy novels, comic books, video games, and other speculative media, began gaining traction in the mid-20th century. During this period, participation in such communities often resulted in social ostracism. Conventions like Comic-Con and fandom clubs at hobby and comic book shops provided havens for those who felt alienated by mainstream society. It was often only at these places that individuals could bond over shared interests and find acceptance despite their social quirks. As someone born in 1992, I grew up during the tail end of the nerds are ridiculed and bullied outcasts trope. Back then, the mainstream media very much looked down on nerds. TV shows and movies made it seem as though anyone who had ever so much as laid hands on a 20-sided die was doomed to spend their high school days being brutally beaten by the inhuman hulks on the football team. But by the time I actually reached high school, this was far from the case. Nerd culture had started gaining traction, and the harsh social caste system that had characterized previous generations had begun to fade. I also remember a time when right-wing commentary on nerd culture was dominated by figures like Jack Thompson, who wanted video games erased completely, lest a child play Mario 64 and promptly jump 4 times their height to crush their teacher's skull beneath their feet. Fast forward to today, and we have alt-writers calling for all female characters in video games to be treated exclusively as sex objects. I'm not sure if either of these is better than the other, but they are certainly different. So, the early 21st century had seen a significant shift. The success of blockbuster franchises such as The Lord of the Rings and the Marvel Cinematic Universe brought nerd culture right into the mainstream. The internet, really facilitated this transition, allowing fans to connect globally and creating platforms for content that appealed to a much broader audience. As a result, being a nerd became not only acceptable, but, honestly, pretty trendy. With nerd culture's mainstream acceptance, the social dynamics within these communities began to change. New members, who had never suffered through the same levels of social rejection, entered the scene. This influx created tension between senior members and newcomers, often leading to, gatekeeping behavior. For individuals who had once relied on these communities as their sole place of social acceptance, the normalizing of nerd culture presented a paradox. While their interests were now celebrated, the safe spaces they had cultivated became less exclusive and, as a result, less tolerant of the eccentricities of their members. This shift forced many to adapt to external social norms within once isolated communities, which in turn exacerbated feelings of alienation. As traditional nerd communities became more mainstream, some individuals struggled to find new spaces where their quirks would be accepted. The sense of belonging that once came easily within a niche fandom was becoming much harder to attain. This situation coincided with the rise of the internet as a platform for a diverse range of subcultures, including, unfortunately, those with extremist ideology. The alt-right, a loosely connected far-right conspiracy movement, capitalized on this dynamic. Its online presence offered a sense of community to those feeling disenfranchised by mainstream society, including former members of nerd culture who no longer felt welcome in their old communities. The alt-right's emphasis on identity and opposition to cultural change resonated with individuals seeking a new sense of belonging. The image of the socially awkward, romantically unsuccessful nerd in particular was a staple of mainstream media for decades. But as nerd culture entered the mainstream, the dynamic shifted. It turns out, it doesn't actually matter if the happy couple walking down the street are dressed in matching Patriots jerseys or cosplaying as Deku and Uravati. the feelings of jealousy and rejection from a lonely passerby remain the same. Now, we can see the same romantic sentiments once expressed by nerds existing within the involuntary celibate community. Incels often share narratives of romantic and sexual frustration, blaming their lack of success on societal norms and perceived injustice. For individuals who would have once identified with the romantically inept nerd stereotype, the incel ideology can be particularly appealing. It provides a framework for understanding romantic failure and offers a community that shares their frustration. The intersection of nerd culture going mainstream and the rise of the alt-right highlights the complexities of social interaction in the digital age. Understanding this dynamic requires a nuanced approach that considers the social factors driving individuals towards extremist movements. While the mainstreaming of nerd culture has brought many benefits, it has also created challenges for those who once relied on its isolation for social acceptance. I'm not upset about nerd culture getting the recognition it deserves. At the very least, it's nice to be able to diffuse a dispute with my boss by making a joke about Aquaman. But the mainstreaming of nerd culture does leave us with questions. What happens to those who thrived in the exclusive communities of the past? How can we foster more inclusive communities that don't push eccentric individuals into the arms of destructive extremist ideologies? The journey of nerd culture from the fringes of society to its forefront has been as epic as any superhero saga. But like all stories, it's the unanswered questions that keep us turning the page.